So we've already talked about some ways of solving quadratic equations. We've talked about the factoring with the zero factor property. We've also discussed the square root property, and you were able to watch the video on completing the square option if you wanted to. The other way to solve quadratic equations is by the quadratic formula, and several of us probably remember the quadratic formula a little bit better than the others. You have to be careful with the other ways of solving quadratic equations, like by factoring. Not everything factors, so you can't always use the zero product rule. Same thing with the square root property. It may not be that you can get it out of that format or get it into the format that you need to take the square root of both sides. The advantage to the quadratic formula is it works on all of them. It works on every single type of quadratic equation and everything. So you probably may remember the same thing. We have to have it in ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 format before we can even start. So make sure that you get it equal to 0 first. And then the quadratic formula says x is equal to a negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Notice the 2a goes underneath everything, so it's going to divide at the very end. So let's do some examples with the quadratic formula. So our first example has x squared plus 6x is equal to 3. This is not currently in the format that we need, because remember we need it to equal 0. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides so that I get x squared plus 6x minus 3 is equal to 0. Now I could try to factor. This one actually does not factor. I could also try the square root property, but I can't because I've got other items underneath here. So the only real method, I could use completing the square, but again, that was an optional form. So in this case, we're going to use the quadratic formula. So my a in this case is 1. It's that understood 1 in front of the x squared. My b is a positive 6. It's the number attached to the x. And my c is a negative 3. Pay attention to those signs, okay? So now I'm going to have the x is equal to a negative b, so that's my 6 here, plus and minus the square root of b squared. So I'm going to have this 6 again. I'm going to square it, minus 4 times my a, which is 1, times my c, which is negative 3. And remember, that is all over 2 times my a, which was 1. Notice how I put everything in parentheses, including the 6 with this negative, because sometimes we may have a negative value for our b, and we have to be careful with that. So now I'm going to start simplifying. So the negative 6, there's not much I can simplify, so I'm just going to leave it negative 6 plus or minus. 6 squared is 36. A negative 4 times 1 is negative 4 times a negative 3 is going to give me a positive 12. Now take the square root of that. 2 times 1 is 2. So I keep simplifying. Underneath that radical, I get the square root of 48. And I need to simplify that radical. I can't just leave it there. I also don't want to divide the 48 by the 2 because I can only take care of what is outside the radical. So whenever I divide out 48, if I need to, I can come over here. Square root of 48 is the same thing as 3 times 16. I know the square root of 16 is 4, and then my 3 stays underneath. I still have this plus or minus 6 over 2. Now I can simplify and divide both of the numbers outside the radical by 2, and I get that x is equal to a 3, because 6 divided by 2, plus or minus 4 divided by 2 is 2, square root of 3. Notice I have an x squared, therefore it says that I should have 2 answers. Well, notice I've got the plus and the minus version here. So if I needed to, for being able to see it, I could say 3 plus 2 square root of 3, and 3 minus 2 square root of 3. And knowing how to break these up into different items will help you on your online homework and things of that nature. So these are my 2 answers for this first example. Now let's look at another example, and it is 4x squared is equal to 3x minus 5. Now again, I can't take the square root of both sides, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move everything to one side. I like to move everything to the side with the x squared to keep the x squared positive. It's up to you though. So I'm going to have 4x squared minus 3x plus 5 is equal to 0. Again, this is one that I could try to factor, but it doesn't actually factor. So I'm going to use the quadratic equation. So my a, in this case, is 4. My b, notice I'm going to pay attention to that sign, negative 3. And my c is 5. So as I start this, I'm going to have x is equal to a negative, my b is a negative 3, plus or minus the square root of my b squared, so a negative 3 squared, minus 4 times my a, which is 4, times my c, which is 5, and that is all going to be over 2 times my a, which again is 4. Now I can start simplifying. Notice, negative and negative, that becomes a positive 3, plus or minus. Negative 3 squared is a positive 9. Negative 4 times 4 is a negative 16. Times a 5 is a negative 80. I'm going to take the square root of that. 2 times 4 is 8. Continuing to simplify, I get plus or minus 9 minus 78, or I'm sorry, 9 minus 80 gives me a negative 72 over 8. I apologize, that should be a 71 over 8. Now, I can't do anything with the 71, but I can with that negative sign. Remember, I cannot leave a negative underneath the radical. So remember what happens to a negative underneath the radical? It becomes an I, square root of 71 over 8. So I actually have 2 different deals here. I have 3 over 8 plus an I square root of 71 over 8. This is one value. My other value is 3/8 minus I square root of 71 over 8. These are my 2 answers for this particular quadratic equation. So try some of the quadratic equations using the quadratic formula and let me know if you have questions.